Throwing smoke.
Now we're talking. Gimme.
You gotta be fucking joking.
My mark! See how long you last.
Hell yeah.
See you later.
Oh, I killed you good!
I'll take that.
Let's get these pieces of shit!
Enemy targeted! Excellence! Enemy spotted! Enemy contact! Yeah, I'll take that.
Locked and loaded!
It's not over. Oh, I killed you good!
Now we're talking.
Enemy targeted! Look out! Gimme. Got it.
Fuck yeah.
Oh, this... Right here.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Oh, no, you don't.
It's up, it's in. Never learn. Enemy spotted! Give me.
Oh, yeah!
Smoke out.
Don't mess with the carbine, man!
Target my mark!
Come on,
Burn on us!
Two, one, go.
what God is it that you believe in? I've heard you talk about this sort of substrate idea and such, but in a simple way that I can understand, do you believe in a man in the sky God? Do you believe in it's a
Well,
force?
that's not as primitive a conceptualization as the atheists would have you
You're
believe.
lucky I'm on your
What do you
side.
believe?
'Cause
Well, there
Griffin don't
isn't
fuck
anything
around,
more
and I
complex in
don't
the known
lose.
universe than a human brain. So if you want a model for reality as such, like proclaiming that it has something akin to the structure of the human psyche is not an absurd claim, given that that is the most complex thing by far that we know of. By far.
What is it you believe?
Well, I've been explaining it.
But I mean,
I did say, I mentioned something which we skipped over very quickly because I introduced it too rapidly. Postmodernists figured out that we live in a story, but then they leapt to a faulty conclusion of two forms, well, three. There's no uniting story. That was one of the conclusions. In fact, the definition of postmodernism is skepticism of meta-narratives. There's no uniting story. It's like, well, that's a stupid theory because there's no union. So what? There's just diversity. Well, we worship diversity now in this utterly foolish manner. There's no difference between diversity and war. Without a uniting narrative, there's nothing but war. So, no, that's not going to work. Wrong. Hedonistic self-gratification. There's Michel Foucault for you, to a T. It's like, why is that wrong? Why can't people just do what they want with whoever they want all the time? Because it defeats itself, and quickly. It's not a sustainable game. If it's all about you and your whims, I don't want to be anywhere near you. And that won't be so good for you. That's not going to work. Power. That's really where the postmodernists landed with their, what would you say, temptation to turn towards love.
See the one with the mark on
It's
it?
all
Ain't
about
that
power.
no fuck?
Like, first of all, that's probably a
Incoming
confession.
drag.
That's what you believe. And second, no, it's not. Try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works for you. Try tyrannizing yourself and see how successful you are. Power's not the game. What's the game? What's the story? I mentioned earlier. It's voluntary, self-sacrifice. Right, you offer yourself up in the service of something higher. That's the basis of society. That's the basis of psychological stability. The Christian insistence is that that's the basis of the world.
Jordan Peterson challenges the common idea of God as just a man in the sky, suggesting that human consciousness might point to something much deeper.
Little help here.
He highlights the brain's incredible complexity, arguing it could reflect a higher organizing principle rather than just being a product of chance. He also critiques postmodernism's rejection of a shared framework, saying that without a unifying narrative, people often chase pleasure or power, leading to conflict. We see this in everyday life. Families function best when they share a purpose, and friendships grow stronger when people put aside pure self-interest. A core idea for Peterson is that a voluntary self-sacrifice is what holds societies together, not blind obedience, but something that gives life real meaning. Power-driven relationships rarely last. When control takes over, connections fall apart. Instead, true unity comes from commitment. In a culture focused on self-expression and instant gratification, he suggests real fulfillment comes from balancing personal freedom with a deeper sense of purpose.
I'm going to ask you again because I want to be clear. Is what is it you what is the God you believe in?
I think that the claim that Christ is the embodiment of the prophet and the laws, I think that's true. Yeah. That's complicated. Very, very complicated. But I think it's true.
So you believe that Jesus was
God?
God?
Yeah. I think if we understand what that means, that it's indisputable. I'll give you a brief explanation of why. Christ takes the sins of the world onto himself. So that means all the problems that there are his problems. Right. Okay, so idea there is that there's no difference between making that assumption and then actually beginning to address those problems. And there's no difference between that which best addresses the problems of mankind and the divine. Those are the same thing. And I can't see how that can be otherwise, because the contrary hypothesis would be that you would adapt best to your life by avoiding things that are difficult and terrible. And no one believes that. And so the pattern of the passion, this is the voluntary self-sacrifice issue taken to its extreme. The pattern of the passion is the decision to voluntarily confront and welcome anything that happens to you, no matter what it is. And that's a terrible thing to ask or ever to undertake. But, well, the alternative is to shrink away. Well, the spirit of shrinking away is the divine. It's like, I don't think so. That's preposterous. The spirit of unlimited courage? Well, that's not a bad start to the definition of what constitutes the divine. The highest possible value. Has your belief?
Jordan Peterson makes a bold claim. When fully understood, the idea that Jesus was God becomes undeniable. His reasoning centers on Christ taking on all of humanity's struggles, not as a passive symbol, but as an active stance. To Peterson, facing suffering head-on is the key to meaning, and anything that best addresses human hardship aligns with what many would call the sacred. He contrasts this with the idea that a good life comes from avoiding difficulty. He argues no one truly believes that, and instead points to Christ's passion, his willing embrace of suffering, as the ultimate example of confronting reality. For Peterson, this isn't just about personal struggles, it's about taking responsibility for the greater human condition. He describes unlimited courage as a starting point for understanding divinity. Facing life's storms, he suggests, isn't just an act of bravery, it's the path to transformation. Shrinking away, by contrast, leads nowhere. While he frames this idea in psychological terms, it resonates with Christian teachings on Christ's role in carrying the burden of sin. Some may argue this reduces faith to a moral or psychological framework, while others see it as a reminder that real divinity is found in action, not just authority. Either way, Peterson's point is clear. True change happens when people stop avoiding suffering and instead commit to something greater.
It's interesting what's going on with young men in particular at the moment, because it does appear, and I don't have the stats on this in front of me, but it does appear that young men are more and more in search of some type of religion.
Yeah, definitely.
I think Islam, I read Islam's on the rise amongst young men, or it's the dominant religion that young men are being drawn to. But in the context of what we've described, that person who's sat on the edge of their bed, do they need religion? And I'm being intentional to say God, I'm saying religion.
Well, these are hard things to do on your own. Right? I mean, you only have the span of your life, and the probability that you can figure out how to live merely as a consequence of consulting your own limited experience is zero. It's too complicated.
So the religion might be your society, it might be your friends or family in this context.
That's part of it. That would be the more structured part, the more traditional part. You need the traditional stories. That's why I wrote this book, is to indicate, well, at least in part, well, what the stories are and also what they mean. It's not only that. It's not only what they mean. It's how knowing what they mean changes your life. So, for example, in the story of Abraham, God comes to Abraham. Now, questions emerge from that statement.
Yeah.
What do you mean, God? How does he come to Abraham? What the hell does that mean? Well, the story lays that out. The God that comes to Abraham is the voice of adventure. It's a definition. So this is a good thing to know. God is the voice of adventure. Okay, so now let's think about this a little bit. So, the God that's the voice of adventure is the God of the forefathers of the Father. He's a patriarchal spirit. Okay, if you're a good father, you speak with the voice of adventure to your sons. Obviously. You know, you're encouraging. It's like, get the hell out there. You know, make something of yourself. Why do you do that? Because you have this little kid and you think, get at it, man. Let's see what you can be. And so that's that voice of the benevolent father. That's the spirit of the ancestors. And behind that, there's the God who's the voice of adventure. If you pursue the spirit of adventure, there will be things you have to give up. Right, you know that. I mean, you know, you're taking steps. We'd even say that. Steps forward in your life. What do you mean forward? What do you mean steps? Well, they're little adventures you have that transform you and transform your circumstances, okay? You have that adventure and you have to change as a consequence of it. You have to give up your immaturity so that you can take advantage of this new opportunity. Okay, and that changes you. Now you're a slightly different person. Now a new horizon of opportunity opens up. You have to make a sacrifice. It's like, okay, looks like if I'm gonna do this, I can no longer afford this. Well, Abraham changes so dramatically that he gets a new name. He starts as Abraham, and he ends as Abraham. Abraham is the father of nations. So what's the moral? If you pursue the spirit of adventure and make the proper sacrifices, you become the father of nations. Right? That's true.
There's a really interesting, I grew up as religious until I was 18. I say religious because it's defined to me, but my mother believed in God, she's Christian, my father's Christian, and at about 18 I started reading a lot of Richard Dawkins' books and other people's books, and I got to this place where I think I was atheist by the definition of I didn't think there was necessarily a God, and now I found myself in this place of being agnostic. Now when I think about the Bible as a compass or as a guide, the part of my brain that's is like, I need evidence for everything. Goes, is this just a book about a bunch of men wrote thousands of years ago when they were sat around a campfire or whatever? And if it is, then it's just one person's opinion. As much as any self-help book on a shelf is one person's opinion.
Well, okay, let's take that claim. I mean, yes, it is stories that people came up with thousands of years ago, but no, definitely not one person's opinion. Definitely 100%. Because these stories have been transmitted over millennia and organized and edited and transformed by a very large. So it's, at minimum, it's a massive collective effort. And it's a collective effort undertaken by arguably the most literate and intelligent people there are, and that'd be the Jews.
Why would I listen to the Bible more than I listen to something Socrates wrote, or any philosopher?
Oh, there's a huge overlap between the Greek philosophical tradition and the Christian tradition. I mean,
Bring it!
Western culture is the amalgamation of Greece, Jerusalem, and Rome. So, and the early Christians saw tremendous parallels between Christian theology and Greek philosophy.
Where do you think we come from? You know, you've got the like Darwinism, evolutionary theory of we've evolved, etc. Then there's the more religious view that, you know, if you really think about the First Testament and the Early Testament and the stories of the, you know, creation, people think, you know, maybe we were just popped out of nowhere. But where do we youth believe that we come from? Do you believe a God put us here, or do you believe evolution is true? Both are true.
You have to read the book.
Yeah, but I want to.
Yeah. I know, but I'm not trying to be a smart aleck in that response. It's a complicated answer.
Yeah.
It's a complicated answer. I think that we're guided by the spirit of need.
Now, Jordan Peterson pushes back against the idea that the Bible is just a collection of opinions from ancient storytellers. He argues it's actually the product of centuries of thought, refined by some of the most insightful communities of their time. Rather than a random collection of myths, he sees it as an evolving body of wisdom, one that deeply influenced the way we understand morality, meaning, and even the figure of Christ himself. He ties this to Western civilization's roots in Greek, Jewish, and Roman thought, suggesting that biblical texts and philosophy don't oppose each other, but work together. This challenges the assumption that faith and reason are always in conflict. Instead, Peterson sees a long-standing tradition where religious insight and deep philosophical reasoning shaped how we define truth and how we interpret Jesus. The conversation also touches on a fundamental question. Was humanity placed here by God, or did we emerge through evolution? Peterson doesn't settle on a simple answer, but hints that there's a deeper synthesis behind these debates. More than science versus scripture, he suggests the real question is about the patterns of meaning that connect human experience, including the role of Christ as a central figure in that story. Some may still wonder if ancient texts hold relevance today. Peterson's perspective suggests that dismissing them could mean missing a key part of what has shaped our understanding of morality, sacrifice, and ultimate truth. Whether one sees Jesus as divine or not, Peterson's argument implies that his story remains central to the search for meaning. And maybe, just maybe, that's no accident.
The truth of the matter is, with regard to the gospel accounts, the mythological and the historical are inextricably cross-contaminated.
Sure.
There's no pulling out the historical Jesus, right? That's a non-starter. And why that is, I don't know. It's very mysterious. It's very hard to understand. As are the, let's say, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay, so what do I think about that? Well, I think that denying the historical reality of Christ is, I think that's just a fool's errand.
Of course.
Why anybody would bother.
So a man exists called Jesus.
Yes.
That much.
Now, there's a claim that is attributed to Christ that he is the embodiment or the incarnation, the fulfillment, let's say, of the prophet and the laws.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What does that mean? I think it's in the Gospel of John. I think Gospel of John closes with a statement that's something like, if all the books that were ever written were written about the Gospel accounts, that wouldn't be enough books to explain what had happened.
Yeah, if all the things that Jesus did.
Yeah, and there's a truth in that. The truth is that profound religious account is bottomless, and the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear, not least because the text itself is deeply cross-referenced. So there's an innumerable number of paths through it. It's like a chessboard. And so it's inexhaustible in its interpretive space.
That's true.
And that's a problem too, because it means it's also susceptible to multiple interpretations, including potentially competing interpretations.
I think a lot of people interpret Paul, for example, the earliest New Testament texts, as saying that if Jesus did not literally rise from the dead, if there was not a man who stopped breathing and then started breathing again, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. That is, Christianity is undermined. Now, that means that, and Paul doesn't say sort of believing that that's false is really bad. He says, if you do not believe this proactively, then your faith is futile.
The problem I have with that.
If you don't proactively believe that yourself, then I think when a Christian asks you, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Are you a Christian? I think you must be committed to saying no, at least under that interpretation of Paul. And even if you're not sure, I mean, it's fine if I say to you, do you think that a man physically rose from the dead? And you say something like, well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. But I think it has a lot of mythological significance, or I think that maybe it happened in a different sense, or it happened in the sense that good fiction happens, then fine. But it needs to begin with that caveat of the simple sort of, historically speaking, I don't know. And I know you don't like to pull out the historical Jesus from the mythological.
That's a good objection.
But it's an important question to ask.
No, of course. It's a very good objection. So I just did a seminar on the Gospels with a crew of about 8 people. And it was the same crew that walked through Exodus with me with a couple of variations. And we spent a lot of time on the resurrection accounts, for example. And of course, that was the toughest, let's say, that was the toughest morsel to chew and digest. The thing about the resurrection accounts is that they're all, look, so I could say something like this, which will just annoy people, but it doesn't matter. I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean.
Jordan Peterson argues that denying Christ's historical existence doesn't hold up, but he also acknowledges the challenge of separating the historical Jesus from what some call mythological elements. He sees the gospel accounts as both deeply symbolic and rooted in real events, resisting the idea that they can be neatly divided into either history or metaphor. To him, these texts have been shaped by countless minds over centuries, making them endlessly rich in meaning, too significant to dismiss. He touches on a key Christian debate. The Apostle Paul's claim that if the resurrection didn't literally happen, the entire faith collapses. This raises the question, does belief in a bodily resurrection define Christianity? Peterson doesn't give a final answer, but sees something in these stories that defies simple explanation. Some might say he avoids taking a clear stance, while others see his approach as honest, wrestling with a mystery that goes beyond rational categories. Peterson's perspective pushes back against superficial readings of Scripture. He suggests the gospel accounts aren't just moral lessons, but profound narratives that shape communities and history itself. At the same time, he acknowledges the need for a historical foundation, something that gives weight to the figure of Christ beyond just symbolism. Some argue this approach challenges traditional doctrine, while others say it echoes early Christian writings that embraced multiple layers of meaning.
I wanted to start by asking you your opinion on some questions that have gone through my mind recently, and there's one that's very specific I think I'll start with, which is that, you know, I think for a lot of my life, and certainly when I was younger, I really bought the doctrine that there was an unbridgeable gap between the scientific way of looking at the world and the Christian way of looking at the world, let's say. And the apparent split between science and religion was a consequence of an incommensurate dichotomy of worldviews, you know, and that the church had been opposed to scientific progress, at least in part because the scientific viewpoint existed in contradiction to Christian doctrine. But then, especially in recent years, in the last 10 years, I've started to understand that that was something like a French Enlightenment / rationalist propaganda campaign, and that there's a different, that the relationship between science and Christianity is much closer than I had imagined. I cottoned onto this a little bit by reading Jung, but that just as the universities developed out of the monastic tradition, the notion that the natural world was intelligible to the inquiring logos, that it had an intrinsic logic, that studying it would be beneficial to man, first of all, that it would be comprehensible and beneficial, and that that was actually a kind of moral obligation. That all struck me as like axiomatic statements of faith that were predicated on the Christian tradition, that were the preconditions for the emergence of science. And you know, I've tried to take that idea apart over the last 3 or 4 years to see if I can find any flaws in it. But I think the evidence that the universities emerged out of the monastic tradition instead of emerging contrary to that, that's absolutely incontrovertible on every grounds you could possibly imagine. And the notion that you need to believe in the intelligibility of the world, the capability of the human logos, and the beneficial consequence of acquiring knowledge. You have to believe in all that to even get the scientific enterprise going. I also think that's incontrovertible, and that those are axioms of faith. And so I don't know if those views are in accordance with your views or what you think about that. So I'd like to hear what you think about that.
This is extremely interesting to me because I never saw the tension between Christianity and science, because very early on as a teenager, I was introduced to the writings of a scientist who was a Christian, who drew my attention to something Alfred North Whitehead wrote. And it was really put in much simpler language by C.S. Lewis when he wrote, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." And so very early on, and I was fascinated by the idea that actually modern science is a legacy of the biblical worldview. And therefore, it's no accident that the pioneers, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Maxwell, and so on, were believers in God. And as you pointed out, it underpins the tradition that lies behind the great universities of the world, that the doctrine of creation was actually the belief, the underlying presupposition that allowed people to do science. So I've come over my life to the conclusion that science and the biblical worldview sit very comfortably together, but it's science and atheism that do not sit comfortably together.
Wow, what an eye-opening discussion between Jordan Peterson and John Lennox. Peterson's realization that the so-called conflict between science and Christianity is largely a result of Enlightenment-era propaganda is something that many of us have wrestled with. For years, we've been told that faith and reason are at odds. But as Peterson points out, the very foundations of scientific inquiry rest on Christian assumptions. Think about it. If the universe wasn't created with order and purpose, why would we even expect it to be intelligible? The Christian belief in a rational creator naturally leads to the pursuit of understanding the world through science. Lennox reinforces this beautifully by pointing to figures like Newton and Kepler, pioneers of science who were deeply rooted in their faith. And here's the kicker. Science and atheism actually struggle to coexist. Without belief in an ordered universe, science lacks a foundation. As Lennox puts it, it's the expectation of law in nature, rooted in a belief in a lawgiver that made science possible in the first place.
Which I know is quite a controversial statement, but at least it gets discussion going.
I just completed a couple of documentaries with the Daily Wire Plus crew, and one of them was in Athens and two were in Jerusalem, and we were trying to puzzle out the relationship between Greek thought and Judeo-Christian thought, how the world might be best conceptualized. So there's a mix of ideas here. And if an organism has to be a microcosm of the cosmos in order to function, and we are a microcosm in that regard, and we are a personality that runs on a narrative, which we seem to be, then in what way is it reasonable to claim that the cosmos itself is best conceptualized as something that can be entered into relationship with, personality to personality, and that's not the most fundamental reflection of reality? I mean, it seems to me that that's where Dawkins' thought eventually points if his proclamation that an organism has to be a microcosm, an accurate microcosm in order to survive, is accurate.
I think there's a lot in that, actually. And I recall listening to you give a very interesting lecture on Genesis 1. And when you came to the statement that human beings are made in the image of God, you paused and you pointed out that this was the cornerstone of our civilization. And I agree with that entirely. I think that what Dawkins is saying actually points in the exact opposite direction to what his worldview is, which is atheism, of course. It seems to me that where this fits together best is first in the fact that we can do science, in the sense that there is a rational intelligibility to the universe, which is the foundation of modern science and is a legacy of the biblical worldview. So that the mathematical describability, Einstein talked about, he couldn't imagine any genuine scientist without faith in that. It's the axiom for doing science is to believe the universe is intelligible. But if you ask for the rationale behind that, why do we believe the universe is intelligible? It bears the imprint of a creator. And I see that at the level of mathematics in its capacity to, at least in part, give us a handle on what's out there. And also in biology, where we have at the heart of every living cell the longest word we've ever found, the genetic code. And all of that leads me to formulate it as follows, that we live in a word-based universe. And that's the key of the Logos for me.
Peterson brings up such a fascinating point, how the Greek concept of logos, the intrinsic logic in the cosmos, aligns perfectly with the Judeo-Christian idea of the word incarnate. It's like two puzzle pieces snapping together. He connects this with Richard Dawkins' observation that an organism must be a microcosm of its environment, suggesting that if we, as humans, reflect the cosmos in some way, doesn't it imply that the universe itself is structured intelligently? And then John Lennox comes in with a knockout observation. Science itself presupposes an ordered, intelligible universe, and that order points to a creator. Think about it. Why does the universe make sense at all? Why does math describe it so perfectly? As Linux says, we live in a word-based universe, meaning it's not just some random chaos, but rather the product of international design. And here's the big takeaway. If we can see patterns and intelligence woven into creation, doesn't it follow that there's a rational, even personal creator behind it all? Linux reminds us that beyond our search for God, there's also divine revelation. God reaching out to us, ultimately through Christ.
So one of the axioms of faith that's necessary before you embark on the scientific endeavor as an individual or as a culture, which might explain why science emerged in the Judeo-Christian context and no other place, is that the universe is intrinsically intelligible. But there's another axiom too, which is that the honest investigation of that intelligibility will be good. It's easy and even rational, it might be easy and even rational to take the Frankenstein monster view of the investigation of the world and to say, well, even if the cosmos is intelligible, that doesn't mean that our investigation into it is intrinsically good or that it would bear good fruit. Now, you have to believe that the truth will set you free in order to be a scientist, because if you believed that the truth had no bearing on human flourishing, let's say, then the whole enterprise would be pointless. We are required to explore, investigate, and communicate about everything as deeply as possible. The trials of Christ are the most extreme trials that can be imagined. And I mean that literally. That's partly why the story has such potency, right? It's the worst possible sequence of events that could happen to the least possibly deserving person. And that's an injunction to accept all of the terrible catastrophes of life full on in this supposition that doing so is the manner in which life most abundant could reveal itself. I don't think you do that without an intrinsic belief that it's something like human beings are made in the image of God. I can't see any escape from that rationale.
It depends that we are committed to the pursuit of truth. Otherwise, as you say, science is absolutely no point. I happen to believe that truth, of course, is not simply propositional truth, but ultimately truth is a person. And that is the very deep claim. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it's interesting there that Jesus wasn't merely saying, I say true things. This goes much deeper. I am the truth. And if we set up a sequence of questions about anything, what is the truth about the atom? Well, you can split it into elementary particles. What is the truth about those? I believe this claim is so big that it's actually saying that at the end of the backward sequence of questions, Jesus Christ will say, I am the truth. And of course that resonates with what you were studying in Exodus so interestingly. I am is the fundamental proposition about the nature of God.
Peterson and Lennox dive into a powerful truth. Science itself rests on the belief that the universe is intelligible and that pursuing knowledge is good. But where does that idea come from? Christianity provides the answer. Genesis states that creation is good because it comes from a rational, purposeful creator. Without that belief, science would have no foundation. Why study a chaotic, meaningless universe? The fact that we can explore and understand the world points directly to a divine order. Lennox nails it when he says truth isn't just a concept. It's a person, Jesus Christ, who declared, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Even atheist scientists like Einstein admitted that the universe's order and mathematical precision imply a superior mind. The fine-tuning of the universe, forces like gravity, electromagnetism, and the cosmological constant, are so precisely balanced that even a slight variation would make life impossible. This isn't coincidence, it's evidence of a creator. Peterson's example of scientific integrity, honesty, generosity, and fairness mirrors the values Christianity upholds. Without God, where do these ethical imperatives come from? Science thrives within the moral framework Christianity provides.
People who know anything about statistics think that you take a spreadsheet of numbers and dump it into a meat grinder and crank the handle and out comes truth. And that is 100% false, because when you're doing statistical analysis, it's a form of critical thinking and exploration, and you're making ethical decisions at every choice point. So you have to figure out which data points constitute outliers, because maybe there was a measurement error, for example, while you were sampling that particular behavior. And you have to tilt the statistical investigation to some degree against the outcome that you're hoping for, to make sure that you don't fool yourself. And it's saturated with ethical decisions. And then that all has to be nested within the presumption, first of all, the presumption that you should not ever publish false data just to move your career forward. You know, and you might say, well, why the hell not? And also that you are required on ethical grounds to let go of your tyrannical presuppositions if the data reveals that what you're clinging to for your own psychological reasons is wrong. And all of that's an attitude of ethical conduct and not a set of explicit stateable propositions. And
yeah, that's hugely important. Richard Feynman, the physicist, the Nobel Prize winner, used to say you must bend backwards to criticize yourself, because you are the easiest person to fool. And I'm very interested in this ethical dimension, because this is over and beyond the propositions and the methodology of science. I think it was Einstein who said, you may talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. So this is another layer in looking at the universe. It's rationally intelligible, but it's also a moral